Welcome to this episode of Crime Inc. with your host, Alexander Benikov.
All right, welcome to this episode of Crime Inc. This week we have one of our returning champions, Mr. Lauren Brown. Lauren is a defense lawyer who's been practicing, I don't want to say a very long time, but long time, right?
Right.
He was actually one of my mentors at the public defender's office in Ann Arbor, where I went to law school in Michigan. I didn't go in Ann Arbor, but I interned at that office. He's one of the most experienced defense lawyers that I know and has a wealth of knowledge. Those that didn't listen to the episode we did with Mr. Brown on season 1, I would encourage you to go back because we got pretty in depth about the work of public defenders and how vital they are to the system. There's a lot of good conversation there, so I'd encourage people to go back and listen to that if they haven't. I wanted to have Lauren on today to talk about one of his more infamous / famous cases to kind of get a defense lawyer's perspective on a high-profile case. Lauren, can you give us kind of the background of how the case came to you or how you learned about it?
Sure, Alex. It was in 2003 or 2004 when I first picked up the case. By that time, I'd been working in the public defender's office since 1991. So I've been there for about 13 years. My boss at the time, Mr. Lloyd Powell, came to me and he said that he wanted one of his more experienced attorneys to handle the case, as it was a double homicide. It was a case that had actually started in Utah and originated, it was probably discovered in Utah and originated here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So my boss came to me, and we'd had a couple of attorneys who'd handled the case earlier, and he handed it off to me, and I was able to take it over before the preliminary examination stage and take it all the way through to trial.
So the boss comes to you and says, hey, guess what? This is your case now?
Yes. That's always a fun thing.
Right. Okay.
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Actually, nothing. Whatever you'd like to ask.
So, did you know anything about the case when you got it?
No, at the time that he gave it to me, I'm not one who typically, and I wasn't then, one who typically followed the news reports or the local crime reports. I guess you can consider it a busman's holiday when I'm, not actually at work. Right. I don't really follow all of the updates. So when I was handed this case, there's your typical buzz in the office. As I said, 2 attorneys before had handled the case. So, I had some idea about what the case was about, but none of the details. You don't really get those until you start looking through the discovery and that sort of thing. So at the time it was handed to me, it was just pretty much a rumor.
Mm-hmm. And what were some of the basics that you had heard?
That we had a double homicide, that our client had actually been arrested in Utah as opposed to in the state of Michigan, and that made it very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember the first time you met the defendant?
Yes, I sure do. I visited him. They had transported him from Utah to the jail. A couple of our attorneys had already visited him by that time, and so I was the third to see him. And in a lot of cases with our clients, there's, trust issues, and you've got 3 different attorneys seeing you. So one of the first things I had to do in visiting him was kind of build up the trust and his confidence that, one, I was going to be the attorney who was going to see it all the way through, and one, that I was someone who was competent.
And how do you, in this case and in general, but how do you do that? Just kind of talk to them?
Yes. So what you want to do is probably the best thing to build confidence in a client is, one, a grasp of the facts of their case, and a demonstration of a grasp of the law that applies. Those are the things that generally will build confidence. Now, you don't always have all of the facts, and sometimes your clients want to tell you, they want to tell their story. And so another thing is you have to allow them to be able to do that. Even if you think you already know what's going on, you really want to allow your client to be able to communicate with you and talk to you about what's going on and what they'd like to see happen. So that was the first order of business, just talking to my client and building that trust.
What were your first impressions of him?
He was a very, very intelligent person. Very intelligent, probably smarter than I was, to tell you the truth.
What kind of intelligence, if that makes sense? You know what I mean? And just kind of
yes.
Go ahead.
Well, he was intuitive about a lot of things. Some people they have to read and study certain things, but this guy grasped a lot of things quickly, and like a lot of clients, he felt he knew the law, but he probably had a better grasp than most. One of the things that was interesting about my client was that he actually had taught himself computer repair, and in his travels, he was always able to get work and get work quickly, comparing or repairing computers. It was nothing that he had been formally trained in. It was just something that he had taught himself. And everywhere he went, whenever he was employed, he was always one of the best employees there.
And can you give a little bit about the facts, because it was a pretty unique case, right, as far as how the bodies were found?
Yes. So the interesting thing about this case, as I said, was our client was arrested in Utah, and the ironic thing about it is that he probably would not have been stopped if the officer, the Utah state trooper who stopped him, actually knew the law. The reason he was stopped is because the trooper saw that he was driving in a vehicle that had no license plate in the front. Now, he was driving from Michigan, and the Michigan vehicle code says that you only need a license plate in the back. But in Utah, they have license plates front and back. So the trooper stopped him because he didn't realize that since the car was a Michigan licensed and registered car, there was no necessity for a front license plate. Once he stopped him and looked into the vehicle, he looked into the back seat, and the thing he saw that kind of tipped him off was a hand hanging out of a cooler in the back seat.
That's a bit of a red flag, right, for a stop?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that'd be the first hint.
There was a second body also?
Yes, there was a second body that was in the trunk of the vehicle. And this body had a cord wrapped around the neck. This was a male. The body that was in the cooler turned out to be the body of a female.
And we'll get into their relationship in a little bit. So you know this when you're meeting with him, and you described him as, I believe, pretty small in stature, kind of quiet, pretty intelligent. Because on one hand you've got somebody, with two dead bodies inside their car. On the other hand, you've got somebody that's, pretty intelligent and composed. Is it one of those things that wasn't really syncing up as far as, the two sides?
Yes, I mean, I think the normal expectation when you have a guy who has two dead bodies, one of which is sliced up, that he's not going to be the most calm guy. It's probably going to be somebody who's going to be hyper emotional and aggressive. Right. Well, this gentleman was not that. He was very soft spoken and very quiet, actually.
Approximately. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say he was a man who had a plan.
Approximately how old was he back then?
He would have been in his late 20s, early 30s.
Okay. As you're meeting him and getting the case going, to you, does it feel just kind of like another case, or did it feel kind of bigger or different, if you remember?
Oh, it was bigger. It's not often that, we get a double murderer, especially under the circumstances that we had in this case. A guy found traveling through Utah with a chopped up body in a cooler and another strangled body in the trunk. So from the beginning, this felt like a very heavyweight case. Plus, there was a lot of media requests as well, and that's always a big sign.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that too. I saw in one of the articles researching this that they tried to get a hold of you, and it was pretty early on, and they weren't able to. Was that part of your strategy, or was that just kind of an anomaly? You know what I mean, as far as talking to the media?
Yeah, part of the strategy. For the most part, when I have a case that's going on or a case at trial, I do not talk to the media. I don't try my cases in the press. What I always tell them is that the facts will come out during the trial. And that's pretty much all you'll get from me with respect to speaking to the media directly about a case.
Was it mostly local Michigan media, or were you getting some national attention?
It was mostly Michigan media. It was, it was a case, as you can imagine, was somewhat titillating. So it was mostly local.
Okay. And is that something that you kind of developed over time? Have you used to have a different approach with the media, or has it kind of always been your approach?
Well, I'm a shy and retiring type, so that's pretty much always been my approach.
That's a good description. I don't know if it's 100% accurate, but what charges was Mr. Daniel facing? Was it just the 2 murder counts? I say just,
Yeah.
but
We had the 2 murder counts plus a mutilating of a corpse.
okay. And you said one of the bodies was cut up?
Yes, that would have been the female body.
Okay.
That was the one found in the trunk. It had been dismembered. And through forensics, they were able to find out that the body had already been deceased before it was dismembered. And so that's why he was also charged with the mutilating of a corpse charge.
Starting to sound like a horror movie a little bit.
Yes.
Was there a plea extended to Mr. Daniel?
No, actually, another interesting thing about this case was that the chief prosecutor himself, actually tried this case.
That's pretty unusual, right?
Highly unusual. It's something that's extremely unusual. It was a high-profile case, and from the prosecution's point of view, they felt it was pretty much a slam dunk. They actually got a confession or statement from my client at the time that he was arrested. And so that was...
I'm sorry, was that in Utah?
Yes, in Utah. They got a statement from him, and it was a recorded maybe 2 hours worth of him rambling. And you better believe they played every bit of that at trial. But because it was high profile, because it seemed like pretty much a slam dunk, I was treated to Mr. Brian Mackey himself, who is the chief prosecutor. He was at the time, and he is still now, handling the case directly.
As far as prosecutor personality is, how would you describe him in a nutshell?
Brian Mackey is a wry sort of personality. He looks like Phil Donahue, and he has... If any of your listeners still remember who Phil Donahue is, I don't know.
I'm sure there's some.
There's probably a couple. But he has a very wry, almost sardonic sort of personality. And he definitely likes to bring that to bear whenever he's doing cross-examinations. So it was interesting to have the chief prosecutor himself being able to go against him.
And obviously you don't know what he was thinking, but did it seem like it was because of the attention or because he wanted to handle it himself, to make sure that, everything went according to plan on his end?
Well, I think at the time he had plenty of experienced and trusted assistant prosecuting attorneys. To me, and I don't mean to make him seem bad or look bad, but I think, this was a very high-profile case. It was something that they thought they could almost certainly easily get a conviction on. It's the kind of thing that, most chief prosecutors, like to come down and do every now and then. A case that's very high-profile that almost will certainly end in a conviction.
So no plea was made?
No plea offer was extended.
Okay.
This was intended to be what they call a show trial.
Okay. And did Michigan back then have the death penalty?
No, they did not.
Okay. So he wasn't looking at the death penalty?
No.
Okay. So you knew pretty early on that the case was going to go to trial, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And because even if Mackey had extended an offer, my client was such that he wasn't going to take any offers.
And was it one of those where I'm innocent or I just want a trial? What was your feeling?
It was, I just want a trial. Well, no. He never, once he started talking to me, he never really said directly that the deaths occurred out of malice. So I guess you could say that really he felt that he was innocent of the charges as he was charged.
And as you as you figure out the case, what was the relationship of the victims, or how did he know them, or how did he meet them?
So the female who had been dismembered was actually his former girlfriend and the mother of his child, and that's speculation because nobody proved that in court. And the male who was found was a gentleman that he had picked up from a shelter in Detroit.
Was there, on the police side, speculation or theory that there may have been other victims, or were they pretty convinced that these were the only two? And again, if you know.
Well, the prosecutor managed to slip this into trial. There was, years earlier, a young child that the dismembered female and my client had. The child had been sick, and no one ever says or knows whatever became of that child. The child's not been seen or heard of pretty much since it would have been maybe 8 years before this, since 1990.
Mid-90s?
Yes.
So you kind of know that the prosecutor is going to try to paint him as basically a serial killer?
Yes.
Okay. About how long did it take for the case to come to trial from the time you inherited it?
It took a while. There were a lot of motions that had to be filed, a lot of pretrial things. So I'd say it took probably, anywhere from 8 to 12 months before we actually got started, from the time I did the preliminary examination to the time we had the trial.
Any of the pretrial motions go in your favor? Any that you remember?
None that we had a few motions in limine to try to keep the crime photos out, and I did get the judge to agree not to publish the most intense ones.
And I'm assuming they would have been pretty gruesome and had quite an impact on the jury.
Absolutely, and that was the reason why we didn't want the jury to see those.
And I'm assuming the prosecutor's argument was, well, they're evidence of the crime. This is, what happened to the bodies. Jury should get to see it.
Absolutely, the prosecution wanted that jury as shaken as possible.
Right. So you kind of talked about some of the strength of the state's case. Obviously, they're feeling pretty confident going into trial, it seemed like.
Oh, absolutely. And again, the prosecutor himself came down to try this one, and the chief prosecutor doesn't try shaky cases, or it's cases that they believe are shaky anyway.
Yeah. So I know from my own trial experience, a lot of the time with defendants, you kind of have a thing where you say, this is the state's evidence, it's very strong, and then the defendant says, well, I don't think it's that strong. Were you guys kind of on the same page as far as the strength of the state's case? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. We had a lot of discussions about how the state would proceed, how they would try to come at him, as it were. And I think we were pretty much in agreement with how they would try to accomplish that. Mm-hmm. So our job was to come up with a strategy that would reveal the weaknesses, the holes in the state's case. And at least it seemed we were pretty much in agreement and how we were going to proceed and how we were going to attack the state's case.
So it seems like the state had a pretty strong case. What was your strategy what was your plan?
Well, our plan was to use the facts that the state was presenting to show that they simply had interpreted the things that had occurred wrong. That sounds pretty funny when you talk about a dismembered body and a guy with a cord around his neck.
Right.
But as the facts came out, it turns out that the body had been dismembered for some time, but they could not show a cause of death for the body. Without being able to show a cause of death, it's harder to show, other than the dismemberment, that the death was by homicide or by some sort of agency, and certainly they couldn't show a motive for any sort of homicide. So that was one of the things that we were able to argue. We argued that the death was in fact accidental, but the reaction to the death was one that was irrational.
Mm-hmm. Did his mental health come into issue at all? Because you mentioned he's pretty intelligent, but
yes, initially, yes, we did have him do evaluations, and that was one of the things that extended the pretrial period. We had him go through evaluations. Eventually, he was found to be both competent and criminally responsible. So, but that did extend the case itself for some bit.
Mm-hmm. What do you remember about picking the jury?
I remember that was something that took quite a while. Again, the advantage the prosecutor had was they had two dead bodies. Not only were they dead, but they were in the guy's car, right. And what was chopped up. I mean, it's kind of hard to make your guy seem sympathetic, at least at the outset when you're doing jury selection. Yeah. But voir dire, that's one of my favorite things. And so I spend a lot of time trying to think of questions which would make the jury try to focus on reasonable doubt, on potential holes in the prosecutor's case. I tried to, in selecting this jury, focus them on how I expected the witness testimony to come out, what I expected to be the holes in the testimony, as well as focusing them on my own expert testimony. In this case, the court, that was one of the motions we did win too, was the court provided us with an expert witness on erotic asphyxia.
Okay. Can you give a short explanation of that for people that may not know?
Okay. Well, erotic asphyxia is basically a sexual predilection of people. It can be done with couples or individually. It's where people, while they're engaged in sex, they do things using either cords or hands to cut off the air passages. And what I'm told is that this increases the sexual pleasure of the person. But what I've also know is that often these things go awry. There have been instances of people who have died from erotic asphyxia because they use contraptions that don't release properly, and then the persons end up being strangled.
There was, for our listeners, you may remember the pretty famous case of David Carradine, the actor. He was right. That was determined to be his cause of death. It was in a hotel room, right. And I don't remember if it was a rope or a cord. So obviously that would go with the cord found around one of the victim's necks.
Well, actually, that was a different. The erotic asphyxia was in the case of the female. Okay. Their argument was that that's what they were engaged in. And you, like I said, it can be done in pairs or in singles. Okay. And so the defense was that it was a case of erotic asphyxia that had gone wrong, and our client, my client, rather than calling the police and admitting to this thing, reacted in exactly the wrong way. He wanted to cover up the death rather than admitting to it. Right. And so,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
And so that took. And what the purpose of that, or the effect of that, is to just break down the notion of homicide. Homicide, of course, is in degrees. Is first degree, where the death is intentional, or the killing of the person is intentional. If it's an accident, then it's not intentional. And so that was the idea, was to break down that element and destroy the prosecution's case for first-degree homicide in the case. In the case of the gentleman who was asphyxiated or had the cords around his neck, the defense was it happened at a separate time, and this was a matter of self-defense. And that the gentleman, I may have told you earlier, he had been picked up from a recovery center. He was a recovering cocaine addict, crack cocaine. And the defense in that case was that he had simply snapped and had attacked our client, and that his death was a self-defense issue.
So the two victims didn't know each other?
No, they would not have known each other.
Okay. Were the victims' families involved at all in the case or the trial?
Yes. Well, in the case of the woman, yes.
No.
Her family came. They hadn't seen her or known what her fate was for years. And so when she was identified, when the body was identified, the family was contacted, and they did come to the trial, and they testified to identify who she was.
And does that add another level of stress having them in the courtroom?
It does. You have an emotional group of people who may periodically be sobbing or crying, and that has an effect on the jury. There's no doubt about that. That's a lot for a defense attorney to overcome.
Yeah, I know that. How long did the trial last altogether?
The trial lasted probably a bit over a week.
Okay.
There was a lot, and we had dedicated full days to it. So it was. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Did you try it yourself, or did you have co-counsel?
Oh no, I tried it myself.
Okay.
I had a lot of strong intern help, much like when you were with me.
I appreciate it. Is that something that you prefer, or does it depend on the case? Or is it something that's usually not available? What's your approach?
Yeah, usually it's not available. I mean, we do have interns, and they're extremely helpful. They do a lot of the work that a co-counsel would do, except for, I do prefer to be able to come up with the strategies and conduct the cross-examinations myself. Also, the jury questions and those sort of things. I much prefer to do that on my own.
Was the trial a stressful time for you personally?
It was. Anytime you have someone's life and livelihood on the line, and that I don't mean that he was facing the death penalty,
right.
But certainly the results of a conviction would be life without parole. That's always a lot of stress. And there was a lot of moving parts in this case, a lot of issues to be dealt with. So much discovery that you had to review. So the short answer is yes, a lot of stress.
Was your impression of your client that he was pretty realistic during the trial about the likely outcome, or was it, your impression that, I think we can beat this? Well,
I hate to say it, but my client was a fairly devious kind of guy. That intellect he had, it went towards a lot of deviousness. In fact, the trial actually, believe it or not, given all the facts and circumstances, was not going too poorly. I felt that our expert witness had put on a very good bit of testimony, had certainly created doubt, because the truth is, when you have a body that's deceased and there's no ability to say how it was deceased, it's really difficult to say that was a homicide. So things were going well, but one thing my client insisted on doing, as is his right, was he insisted on testifying.
That was going to be one of my next questions.
Well, he insisted, and I counseled him not to. I felt that we had enough where we could argue reasonable doubt, and keeping in mind that you still always have to overcome two separate dead bodies, and most juries aren't that forgiving.
Right. Yeah. One body's bad enough, but then when you have two,
you got two. One of them with you.
Yeah, one's missing body parts.
Mm-hmm, yeah, so that's a lot to overcome. But even having said that, we had made a lot of headway, but my client insisted on testifying, despite all of my advice, all of my cajoling him not to. That was his right. He had an absolute right to do that. And he was on a mission when he hit that stand. What I haven't revealed is that there was a motive for why he did much of he did, and something that the prosecution seized on. He had found a new girlfriend, and someone to whom he wanted to marry. Now, my client had lived a very vagabond type lifestyle. He moved frequently from city to city. As I said, he was always able to get jobs because the guy had a genius for being able to do computer repair. And so wherever he moved, he's always able to get jobs with computer repair companies. And and as the prosecution was able to put their case together, they said they could show that he had been in Kansas for a little bit, he was in California for a little bit, and each time he was always with this woman who was deceased. But at some point, she disappears. And she's not seen again until her arm is seen sticking out of a cooler in the back of the vehicle. So my client, he felt betrayed because his motivation in doing a lot of he did was to get a new ID. That's how he ended up picking up the homeless guy and bringing him to his home in Ann Arbor. He wanted to actually buy this guy's identity. He wanted the guy to sell him his identity.
Oh, wow.
And so, and all of this was so he could marry this new young lady. Mm-hmm. Well, at some point they have a breakup because he's not moving fast enough to do what he needs to do so they can get married. She gets angry and goes back home to Las Vegas where she lives. So you can conjecture that our guy with 2 dead bodies in a trunk driving through Utah is headed to Nevada. And, we don't know why or what his ultimate goal is. But when he hit that stand, it was clear he had an agenda. He was angry at his, fiance for, what he felt leaving him or betraying him. And every bit of testimony he gave was somehow to try to drag her into this.
Right. Which a lot of the time defendants think will somehow help, right?
Right. Well, I don't even know if he believed that. To him, he wanted to drag her into this. He wanted to somehow get her wrapped up in this.
And did the jury react to his testimony about as you'd expect of somebody that gets pulled over with 2 dead bodies in their car?
Absolutely, as you'd expect. Yeah. For a while there, I thought maybe, they were listening. I felt like they were listening. But when he hit the stand, it pretty much came. I don't think they liked him at all. The prosecutor, Mr. Mackey, is an experienced prosecutor, and he was able to exploit my client's sort of bitter, angry attitude to his advantage. And I don't think the jury liked him very much.
Was the prosecutor's cross pretty lengthy, or did he keep it pretty short?
Oh, it was lengthy because the more he could get my client to talk, the angrier my client was, and the less he helped himself.
Right. Is it one of those feelings where you kind of feel like all your work is falling apart, and everything that you've worked on, the longer he keeps talking?
Absolutely. The longer he was in, so my redirect tended to be somewhat short to try to have him say less and try to rehabilitate him. But even then, he was determined. Mm-hmm. He was determined to implicate her without really implicating himself. And so it was a mess.
And I'm assuming he testified towards the end or at the end of the trial?
Yes.
Okay. So at this point, the jury's seen the pictures, they've heard the whole state's case, right?
Well, the pictures weren't published.
Some of the pictures.
Just some of the pictures, yes. And heard the state's case.
Okay. So your strategy was focused on the autoerotic asphyxiation.
Yes, and the self-defense aspect of it. I had to attack both of the homicide allegations. So yes,
Did you feel you were getting the jury back a little bit, or after his testimony, did you feel most of them were pretty far gone?
Well, the way it went was, of course, the prosecution put on their case, talked about the bodies and the family and that sort of thing. So when we got to put our case in chief on, the first thing we put on was the expert to testify about the erotic asphyxia. And you could see in watching the jury that they were interested. They would lean forward. You could see like there was I see. Oh, okay, this makes sense. So for a while there, it looked like, they were kind of understanding at least that the prosecution hadn't really shown that our guy had done these or committed these homicides with the needed intent until he hit the stand.
And I'm sure it's frustrating because you told them, exactly how it would play, how it would sound, how it would affect the jury, and then they say, no, I still want to do it.
Right, because he had a plan. He had an agenda.
Yeah, and a lot of the time with my own cases, they think, they're going to say something magical or get
Right,
through,
right.
and the jury's going to say, oh, okay, well, that's we don't care about the two dead bodies, or we don't care that you're not making sense. You know,
Hmm.
that's frustrating feeling.
Yeah, we've all had those clients who think that they can talk their way out of things.
Right.
Not,
Yeah.
they're not just.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it's funny because sometimes they've had a decent degree of success with
right.
it, and
Hmm.
then but again there's degrees, and when there's two dead bodies in the car, the degree of difficulty is pretty high.
It's pretty high. So,
What and For listeners, Ann Arbor's obviously University of Michigan, very educated town. Was the jury pretty educated?
yes, usually we do have a high level of education in the juries there. It's not always students, but we get a lot of nurses for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
So
So how long did the jury deliberate?
they were out for quite a few hours. And mainly that was because there was so much information that had to be digested, so much testimony they heard. They asked for a few things, they hear a few things again. I think I think it was his testimony. They wanted to hear certain aspects of his testimony over again. So they were out for a while.
I don't know if you're this way, but with me, with my own juries, I feel like the longer that they stay out, the more optimistic I become. Do you do that at all?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's maybe anecdotally true anyway.
Yeah.
If they're out for a while, that means that they're going over all the stuff. They haven't decided immediately that
Right.
our people are guilty, and so now they're just taking the time to look at stuff, and maybe compromise comes in, or maybe a more critical eye towards the prosecution's case comes in at that point.
Did they stay out longer than you thought, or did it seem about right to you? What was your feeling when they went out?
See, that's the funny thing. Even by that time, I had realized there's no way to protect juries.
Right.
You may spend all your time arguing in closing about how the real suspect was someone who had brown hair and had held the gun in their left hand. When they get in that jury room, they're talking about whether the shoes were brown or black.
Right.
They're focused on something like that. And so it's hard for me to ever, and I don't even try to predict how long the jury would be out.
Right. What was the verdict?
The verdict, unfortunately, was guilty on all counts.
And the sentence was life without parole.
Life without parole.
How did he take it?
Again, he was a very quiet guy. He was quiet. He didn't react emotionally, didn't get upset. Just, okay.
And I'm sure you were less than shocked with the verdict, right, when you heard it?
Right, yeah. After all was said and done, the tendency of attorneys, criminal defense attorneys, is, we'll have a gut reaction when we first see the facts of a case. But then you start working on it, you start researching it, you start coming up with your strategies, and sometimes you'll fall in love with your case.
Yeah.
Hey, I can do this.
Yeah.
I can do this.
Yeah,
But-
I know the feeling where you talk yourself into it. You're like, hey,
Right,
maybe
right.
this is a good issue.
Right. But in the end, it's probably your first reaction that's probably always going to be the strongest, because that's what the jury goes with. The jury goes with their first feelings about, unless you have some really awesome stuff, the first reactions are always going to be most important. That's why voir dire for me is so important.
How did, if you remember, the victim's family react?
They were fairly stoic. I think, after not having seen her for years, I think they had, or heard from her, I think they were, fairly certain that she had come to a bad end. Mm-hmm. I think this was just simply catharsis for them.
Mm-hmm. So Mr. Patrick was, I always get it backwards, is it Daniel Patrick or Patrick Daniel? Patrick Daniel.
Right, Patrick Daniel.
So he gets sentenced to life without parole?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Go ahead.
I was going to say, there's a, I guess, subscript or a postscript.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Well, a few years ago, we got a notice in our office that an individual at one of the Department of Corrections facilities had been caught attempting to plot an escape. They had gathered materials, including a homemade flashlight and a compass, a homemade compass, and had gathered sheets. And they were actually going to try to make a break for it. The guards who tossed his cell discovered all these things and realized that there was not going to be any Shawshank Redemption for Mr. Pat. Yeah.
Was it a pretty high-level security facility?
Yes, but Mr. Daniel, who had been an A1 prisoner, model prisoner, had earned quite a few privileges, and some of those privileges gave him access to the things he had cobbled together to try to effect his escape. And I've likened him, and I've said he was a very smart genius. Basically, he was Lex Luthor without the lab accident.
Right. Well, that's a fascinating story between the identity theft and the bodies and the driving cross country to the new girlfriend. Anything that you feel like you learned about being a defense lawyer from that case that you've kind of carried forward? Was there, and the reason I asked that is because when I was interning with you, you'd always ask us what we learned, which now I ask my interns. So was there something that kind of stuck out that you took away?
Yes, always keep your clients off the stand.
Yeah, all the trials I've done, I don't think I can think of one where I didn't want them to testify and they did, where it helped.
Right, exactly right, because it rarely does.
I had a client a couple of months ago challenge a prosecutor to a fist fight from the stand. So it's just one of those where you put your head down and say,
How'd that verdict?
Go ahead.
How'd that verdict work out for you?
Yeah, about as well as you'd expect. I had another client challenge a different prosecutor to an intelligence contest.
Oh.
So a lot of my clients like challenging prosecutors, so all kinds of good stuff. So, hey, Mr. Brown, thank you so much for telling that amazing story. It's pretty incredible.
Well, you're welcome, Alex. Anytime.
Thank you so much.
All righty.